Well, so I'm clear people are following the news. The second impeachment's happening. And guess what? Drew and I are not going to be covering it.
Yeah.
We're going to wait to a later time. But today we are going to be talking about kind of a plethora of international events. There seems to be a trend in Russia, India, and now Myanmar. There are protests, and I think it's showing a trend. So today, Drew and I are just going to do somewhat of a housekeeping slash just discussion on why these protests are happening and what's happening around the world. Drew, how are you, man? I heard you went backpacking last week. How was that?
It was good, man. It was good. Yeah, a couple days ago, I backpacked in Los Padres National Forest in Southern California, and it was beautiful. It was like super hot in the middle of the day, and then super cold at night. Got below freezing. It was like a land of extremes, but I enjoyed it a lot. But that being said, it's kind of a good way to describe how I've been following politics lately. Like I after the whole riot in the Capitol, and then the inauguration, I kind of took a step back I wanted to take, or like mentally, for a little bit from politics, and that backpacking trip was a good way to do it. But now that now I'm back from that, it almost does seem like there's a lot happened that I quote unquote missed or need to get caught up on. And I think maybe a lot of Americans might feel the same way, because we've been so, kind of taken aback by what's happening in our own country that, it's good to be reminded of what's going on around the world. And so I'm glad we're doing this episode, because there is a lot going on around the world, including protests for various reasons in three countries. So, like you mentioned a little bit, today we're going to be looking at, Myanmar. There was a military coup, which is pretty wild. We're going to be looking at India with some of the largest protests in the largest democracy. And then also Russia. We have, someone who was, what he claims to have attempted poisoning and assassination, is now in prison after returning to Russia, sparking protests there. So I'm stoked to get into this stuff, because it's just, it's nice to not talk about Trump for once.
Absolutely, and I'm worried we're going to be probably talking about Trump again pretty soon. So it's nice to kind of get a detox from just the craziness of the U.S. for a little bit, definitely. And you're right. And there's an interesting trend going on. I mean, we've been covering it, on and off for a while. There's a lot of protests against countries or inside of countries that I think we kind of think are democracies, and sometimes maybe they're not. And I just wanted to start with kind of this just blanket statement, mainly with Russia and Myanmar. So if you're okay, do you want to start with those two? Because
Sure.
I actually think that there's a parallel between Russia and Myanmar. It seems like both of them have kind of crossed the brink from the illusion of democracy to now clearly just a one-party rule.
Yeah.
And why I mean that is, well, in Myanmar. So let's just start with Myanmar for a second. Just a quick background, because you and I did an episode, I think about a year ago now, on this actual crisis in the Rohingyas, who are basically being killed off by the military and the Myanmar Burmese government. And so basically what happened is I think it was 1948, Burma, as it was called at the time, had their independence. And since then, basically the military has brought stability and a one-party rule to the country. But then in, I think it was the late 80s, the daughter of Aung San, who is Aung San Suu Kyi, she basically became kind of this national leader with the National League for Democracy. And she was locked up for a long time. But then in 2015, she became the leader of Myanmar's first civilian government. And it took more than half a century to do so. But basically, the military still is in power. But the NLD, or the National League for Democracy, actually had a majority and kept winning more and more majorities in all these elections. And the military still has been controlling the state in terms of who actually has the final say. But she kept trying to see how far she could get. Like, for example, she wasn't allowed to be a president, so she crafted the role of a state counselor with the hopes to kind of sidestep the military. But what happened last week is that there was another kind of landslide election for the NLD party, which happened back in the fall. But since then, the military's kind of decided, okay, we're not going to let this party kind of masquerade inside of our establishment anymore. And they did what I don't really think was completely a military coup. I think it was just a consolidation of power. And yes, so now she is back in jail, and the military is running the country again. And it's kind of alarming. But again, I don't think this country was ever a democracy. We've tried to dress them up as a democracy, but it's an authoritarian regime. And now we're at a part where Xi is popular, the NLD is popular, but the military controls it. But what do you do when now the military has openly done something of a quasi coup and removed her from any power? Because now it's out in the open. It's an authoritarian regime.
Yeah, it was kind of the wolf in sheep's clothing,
Mm-hmm.
which is a good. Both Myanmar and Russia are like that. Yeah, I mean, I think I watched this 8-minute video, which I'm not going to play here right now. But it has. Let me get her name real quick. I wrote it down. Laurel Miller, the director of the Asia program at the International Crisis Group. She this redhead lady here talks about how there was institutional problems that led to this. And again, it's looking at the history of Myanmar. The military has been in power for so long. It was only because of the massive protests in 2007 that they even let up a little bit and allowed democracy, quote unquote, to happen in Myanmar, right? And this this director of the Asia program, she talks about how the world at the time was like super celebratory, almost prematurely, that Myanmar is now a democracy, welcome it to the democratic world in open arms. And the problem was that the institutional things, which we talked about on our previous episode, is that 25% of the parliament is reserved and needs to be reserved for military officials. So that's, a quarter of your government. And the kicker is, to make constitutional changes in Myanmar, you need over 3/4 of parliament. So if the military always has 1/4 of parliament, and the military boys, I imagine, probably all vote together on decisions, right? They'll all lobby together. They probably don't split at all or much, is my guess. And so if you can just retain that 25% of the military, then there will never be constitutional changes. So one of the reasons that people think that this happened right now is because Sun Suu Kyi was trying to make constitutional changes that were, that the military thought were, against them. What's interesting is they probably could have avoided those changes just by voting their certain way, but instead they did this coup. Now I'm interested to think. So you said it's not a military coup, but a consolidation of power. Like, what do you mean by that?
So the reason why I say that is because the military was always in power.
Okay.
There was kind of this facade of, okay, I mean, it's actually more than just a facade, because the NLD in the last election won 83% of Myanmar's vote. And the US, what is it? The USDP, which is the Union Solidarity and Development Party, which is basically the military, only won 7%. And so the military, in my opinion, who has always been in power, let's remember that the leader of the NLD and the state councillor, she was never in charge of the country as much as she wanted to be. The military were always overseeing it. So she was kind of dancing on a line between leading the country and appeasing the military.
Right.
And I think that they're getting nervous and scared. So they actually just did what was already their right, which was getting rid of her, which I'm not agreeing with. But I just don't think it's a blatant coup, because they never really didn't have powers. That's all I would say.
Yeah, it's just, they were just kind of like, yeah. I see what you mean.
Which
I
was
see what
stupid.
you mean. I see what you mean.
Which was stupid.
Yeah. So
Yes.
they also claimed that the elections that Sun Suu Kyi won over 80% of the vote in were fraudulent. And they claimed that I think it was something like 6 million votes were fraudulent, and that's their justification for why they're taking over the government for 1 year, is what I'm hearing now. So the military says, we're going to take over the government for 1 year, then we'll give you back your democracy. Again, it's a weird thing to think, like, will it ever really be a democracy if it's like this? If the military can just take it and give it as it wants to. Whereas in the United States, we have a very strict thing about the military doesn't get engaged in politics. That's I think you're right that it may have never even been a democracy truly in the first place. And this is, I mean, pretty much that's what it is on the ground. If 84% of people want someone to be in power and they can't be, then it's not a democracy. So what's the reaction is some of the protests now. So if you see, like, Al Jazeera today's put out a video about, Myanmar police firing rubber bullets, warning shots at protesters. I saw a viral video of 2 Myanmar police switching sides as they were hosing down protesters today. 2 of them thought this was, I have had enough, and they switched over to the people, put their shield up to block the hose. Now that's a nice, goody two shoes feeling story, but we'll have to see if there really is enough public pressure to change something like this. The last time we did see the amount of protests we're seeing in Myanmar was 2007, when the military relinquished power somewhat to a democracy before. So it could happen. I'm interested to see what the big players are. So what do you think major players are going to think about this, Alex?
So the Atlantic had a great line where it was basically like Obama's success with Myanmar is now going to be Biden's nightmare, which is kind of interesting because for people who maybe didn't listen to that other episode we did, it was Barack Obama and Ben Rhodes of the state, or of one of his national security advisors, who were kind of instrumental in talking with Xi and actually really helped her kind of get this seat at the table in the NLD, where she did become the state counselor.
Right.
So it was a huge victory for Obama's administration to kind of recognize her as somewhat of a quasi leader of Myanmar on an international stage. But then, flash forward a year and a half, you had this escalating genocide. Let's just call it a genocide. That's what it is, of the Rohingya Muslims, who just didn't really fit into what the ruling Buddhist party called as kind of a unity inside of the country. And she basically went in front of the Hague and said it wasn't genocide and said it was okay. And that's why I read that quote from The Economist at the beginning that said, attempts to dress up authoritarian regimes as democracies are always bound to fail. And, we talked about this with Ethiopia right now,
Right.
is it's a very similar thing. Is she won a Nobel Peace Prize, and then about a year later, she's actually I wouldn't say instrumental, because she probably didn't want to kill these people, but there's nothing she could have done because, again, of the power of the military. And so I think there's going to be a really tough issue with Biden going into this, because he's already talked about responding. But sanctions are just going to hurt the poorest. And at the same time, if we push them away, the Chinese are there. And I was reading an interesting part where, let me see, there's a name for it. Yeah, there's the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which is over $21 billion worth of country.
Right.
And it's just basically this openness at this deep water port. There's a railway, oil, and gas pipelines. And so I think the U.S. especially is in a very tough position right now, because we don't want to push them towards China. And I guess one of the main reasons why the military actually wanted to let the NLD get some power was because they didn't want Myanmar to go closer to China due to tourism. So to go back just a little bit, I actually think the military, this is something I meant to say, is that I think the military was stupid for openly getting rid of Xi, because now it's out in the open that they are against it and countries are going to respond. But to answer your question, I think it's going to be tough, man. I don't know what Biden does. Do you sanction them? Do you open up diplomatic talks with the generals? I don't know. But I think it's going to be tough, and China's going to move in.
Yeah, China's definitely going to move in. And I think that's a big part of this story, is that, the bigger players, like you said, Biden wants to do sanctions. And while I agree with you, sanctions mostly only hurt the little guy, I don't even think it would hurt Myanmar that much anyway. I really don't think we even do much business in, besides some maybe textile stuff. I think most of, like what you said, is Myanmar is more concerned with their relationship with China. I don't think they look to the West as their leaders at all. Sure, it's nice to get a nice, pat on the back from Barack Obama, but I think Myanmar is more worried about what China wants. And like you said, they're part of that Belt and Road initiative that China's pushing so much in the foreign world and outside of their domestic infrastructure, is just helping these other Southeast Asian, Middle Eastern countries, Eastern European countries, even African countries get on board with Chinese implementations of infrastructure. That's super important to Myanmar, way more than Biden sanctions, I think. So I really don't think the U.S. has much to even do. We can say all we want, and we should. I think it's still valid to call out, hey, we don't really want military coups. I mean, we don't we've had kind of problems with some weird stuff like that ourselves recently. Maybe not not to the scale like this, but no one likes coups. And so I see why Biden would want to call out sanctions. Obviously, I think it's already happening that we're seeing, the UN say that there's no evidence of the electoral fraud that the military is claiming in Myanmar. There's definitely voting rights groups and humanitarian groups that are saying that already. Including, let me just get, including one. I had a source somewhere. I'm sorry, but there's definitely groups claiming that these fraud claims are unfounded. And so I don't really know what the U.S. could do. I think that Myanmar is more worried about China, and I think the part of that Rohingya thing plays a part of it. Because San Suu Kyi probably, like you said, probably doesn't want to be engaged in a genocide by her military, but was caught between
I'd hope not.
a rock and a hard place. Not only did she have to not piss off her own military, I also think if you have an economic relationship with a major power that's also engaged in a genocide of Muslims, maybe don't criticize the genocide. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if she wants to maintain her relationship with China as a trading partner, calling out her own Rohingya genocide by her military would also probably bring to light concerns about the Uyghur Muslims in China. So there might be a little bit of that as well.
That's a really good point. I didn't even think about that, but that's true. I mean, they're they both can share that unfortunate, black mark of being involved in some sort of cultural cleansing.
Right.
And the interesting thing though is that there's a guy named Kurt Campbell who's on Biden's National Security Council, and he actually in 2009 was part of Obama's team to kind of bring Myanmar to the table. And he is there again. Again, like I haven't been super impressed with some of Biden's policies so far, but I've liked on the international scale what they're doing. Antony Blinken last night was talking about that, but this guy I think could be instrumental. The Economist has a good article on this guy, Kurt Campbell, and he basically they think could be instrumental in at least, I don't know, like bringing back something like democracy. But then again, like, is it going to be just a facade again? I don't know. But I think that's an interesting point you have is that China and Myanmar unfortunately share some grievances with a group inside their country that they deem deplorable. So we'll see what happens there.
And calling it out, and that's why she's not calling it out. Like, even if she had the moment to be like, hey, we messed up with Rohingya, I don't think she would call it out because it would then also turn eyes to her biggest trading partner, right? That's like that's like the warrant of the argument.
Definitely. I totally agree. So let's move to Russia. Are you down to take a little trip north?
Let's do it.
I just want to plant an idea here, and I want to know your opinion, and then we can get into Russia. I think Russia and Myanmar are having the same exact problem right now. I think that Alexei Navalny, for a long time, Putin has actually wanted to keep around because it gives the facade of democracy, right? There's a term in political science for Russia specifically called managed democracy, which is basically the idea of you have a strong state, which is basically a one-party state, but you keep kind of a fringe party around so people think they have options. And it kind of seems like he's been that for a long time. But then again, recently, Putin's kind of crossed the brink when they actually now have locked him up. They've tried to poison him. They are clearly now trying to actually get rid of him. And to me, it's like Myanmar, where the generals finally decided to do something about this opposition.
Yeah. Alex Navalny is definitely one of the like for someone like us who's like really engaged in politics, we understand that like Russia kills journalists, threatens people, has kind of a lock on free press, and this is nothing new. But I think what's significant is just how open and blatant it is, and it's so blatant that Navalny was like poisoned. Right, the Russian government is trying to say that he was just we had nothing to do with it. He probably was just food poisoning. The dude was poisoned by the government. It's so blatant that I think it's really waking up maybe a lot of Russians to what's going on, or at least getting people that maybe weren't politically engaged now engaged. And one thing that I just found here from the Moscow Times, it says 1 in 4 Russians watched Navalny's Putin Palace investigation. So I guess he put out,
oh boy,
so yeah, 1 in 4, right? So the power of media, right? The investigative documentary. Navalny's investigation alleges that Putin and his close associates laundered money to build the opulent Black Sea Palace. Boom. So there, just like one little investigation about corruption, 1 in 4 Russians watched it. So Alex Navalny is obviously striking a nerve with the public, with Putin himself, and so that's like, it all makes sense. They see him as a threat. He's influencing people to view Putin as what he really is a corrupt billionaire crony oligarch that has buddies in power, and they will maintain power until they can. So
yeah.
But now that it's blatant that he was poisoned and then he was sent to Germany, allowed to go to Germany for it was just like to get some medical help. And then upon arrival back into Russia, he was arrested and put on trial. And now you're seeing that Navalny is calling for protests in the courtyards of big cities. There's a lot of protests going on. And we've seen protests spark in and out of Russia for a while against Putin. That's nothing new either. But I think that Navalny is definitely someone people can rally behind, like a real leader and a face to put on a movement, and that's why he's so dangerous.
Yeah, definitely. And I first off, I kind of wish I'm kind of jealous of Putin's Black Sea casa. Looks pretty nice from what I've seen. but all jokes aside, I do think that Putin and Navalny represent just two completely different Russias. You have Putin's kind of the pride and, nostalgia for Soviet Russia. And Navalny is what the younger generation wants. They have phones, they have somewhat of a facade of openness. They don't want a corrupt state that masquerades as a democracy. And from what I've seen, older people still gain a lot of Putin support, but the younger generations don't. Now, I think it's careless that Putin actually has taken these actual steps in assassinating Navalny because, like in Myanmar, when the generals decided to actually remove Xi, it's kind of crossing that line, right? Because now people know, it's out in the open, that this guy's an enemy of the state, and he was never an option. He's jailed. And now I think we've seen the repercussions of that. Germany, Poland, and Sweden all declared a Russian diplomat a persona non grata, which is kind of like an enemy of the state, basically. And so the EU is reacting, which I'm happy to see. Even Poland, which is quite right-wing and buddy-buddy with Putin, they're even calling this out. So just on an even EU international scale, there's going to be some serious blowback. Now, Germany has this Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. So I'm curious now how that plays out. But we're seeing this thing as like, okay, Russia's been somewhat of a NATO quasi-ally with a lot of these countries, but it's clearly not a democracy. And I wonder what's next, because Putin's literally like a 21st century czar, and nothing topples that except a revolution, in my opinion.
Yeah. And now you have a martyr, a big popular martyr that people can rally behind. Will it go all the way? I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that. But I do think that Navalny is like it's so obvious that he was an attempted assassination, and he's popular among the youth, that if there's anyone to really shake things up, it could be this. It could be this moment. And it really does. I don't know. It really does take some monumental shifts to get rid of someone like Putin. Because again, you have to remember that Putin is stepping down eventually, but he's most likely going to keep someone in power that's just like him. And then he's also exempt from, I think, any investigations after he's out of office. I just pulled up his palace, by the way, and dang, that thing looks fire.
Sign me up, man.
Let's see. Its estimated cost $1.4 billion to build. Billion. Dang, dude, that is crazy. Look at him smiling at his hockey team.
There's a lot of rumors that Putin could be the richest man in the world.
Yeah, because we don't even know how rich he is. We don't even know. He doesn't even disclose it. I'd buy it. Or at least up there with some of the big dogs. Yeah, pretty wild. I really hope that I can see a day where, well, I definitely will, but I definitely will see a day where Putin no longer exists. But I definitely hope I can see a day where Russia's actually like a democracy, like you said, like Myanmar, like it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is a faux democracy. He is a czar,
yes.
And people like Navalny are exposing that.
Well, now it's all out in the open. So maybe now that the people know that there's actually no choice, maybe that's when they finally react. Now that they know that Alexei never had a chance of anything, maybe that younger generation reacts. I don't know.
That's a real stop the steal right there. That's actually worth stopping a steal.
True.
Because Putin does legit steal elections. That is worth an actual uprising. And then, okay, do you want to touch on India a little bit? Let's do a little quick India. The last big protest we've seen in the last couple weeks is, it might even be the biggest of all in history, which is the massive protests coming out of the Punjab in India. led by the agricultural farmers of that region, against the regulatory changes that India's doing on their agricultural industry. And so, obviously, Alex and I, neither of us are Indian. I've never been to India, so we're certainly not experts in this field. But it's a super interesting topic because it's looking to be one of the largest protests ever in any democracy, just because of the sheer number of people involved, the implications for the largest democracy, which is India, and we've talked about Modi recently and before about authoritarian slips and his Hindu nationalism, and how now this is playing a part in India's agricultural industry. And so what happened, as far as I understand, is that India had for a long time had a minimum amount of rupees that they would pay to their farmers for their crops. And it was like a guaranteed payment. You could basically call it a subsidy, I guess, to maintain that their agricultural sector is strong and supported, and the millions of impoverished people in the Punjab can at least have money to survive. Now the changes Modi's government wants to make would be to get rid of that minimum amount of payment that they would receive from the government and open up the agricultural sector to private investment. Modi's government has claimed that this would, they've claimed that this would increase their profits. Here, I'll get it right here. Leaders of the ruling BJP party, which is Modi's, says that the new farm laws would double farms' income, a promise made by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2016. So they said it would double their income. The farmers themselves don't seem to believe that to be the case, and they've protested against this opening up to private investment, and they want those price guarantees. So that's kind of just like a basic background. So, yeah, I mean, what do you think, Alex? What's your initial gut reaction to something like this?
So I'm at first, it's kind of actually been huge because you now had Greta Thunberg being involved in this, Rihanna. There's a lot of people who I don't think you would have worried farmers. And then yesterday or the day before, there was that basically breakage in a glacier that flooded, and there's hundreds missing, dozens dead.
Yeah, tragic.
And I think it's all related, right? It's all there's definitely a climate crisis inside of India. And so we have international spotlights on this. Greta Thunberg, there's now apparently the Indian government is investigating her for a conspiracy because they think she's trying to stop the government and all this crazy jazz.
Oh my God.
But I do want to say, with the sheiks in the Punjab region who are protesting, there is one thing that I think is interesting, is that I was reading out of the The Guardian, and it was talking about how this group of sheiks basically has always had extreme political might inside of India when it comes to agriculture, and now they've lost some of that, so they're angry. I kind of would equate it to unions who have always had a say, who might be kind of eroding some of their power, and so now they're angry. So I'm curious if it's just because they don't like not maybe seeing the same thing happen again, or if it's actually going to be detrimental to them. And I think only time will tell us that. But the worrying thing is the violent protests have been nuts. There's trucks that have torn down bridges and blockades. The police are getting violent. And to me, the more worrying part is that India is basically getting rid of free speech. They basically are cutting off Wi-Fi, phone service, just in anticipation of protests, not even due to violent protests. There's an idea that speech in some African countries, there's always a joke inside of Uganda that free speech is only free until you say it, and then everything's out the door. And I think that's kind of what India's taken to the next level, is they're basically saying, before you can say it, we're just going to stop it. And I never really thought India was a great democracy. I think it is nuts that for a while they were pluralist. They were looking for, the idea of conversation, parliamentary discussion, stuff like that. I like. But clearly under Modi, that is not happening. It's a Hindu national state. And this just seems to be another step in Modi's kind of breakdown of free speech. So that's about all I can say.
There's definitely two angles to this. The first one is the economic angle. And I think that let's not forget that agriculture, I think in most, at least in the United States, agriculture's always been treated a little bit differently than what we'd always consider the free market. farmers in the United States receive a ton of subsidies, and especially during the pandemic. A lot of farmers were paid to just have crops at the ready in case things got better again. And then a lot of them were forced to just like throw away old crops, but they were still paid for it by the government. There's a lot of weird transactional things that go on in agricultural sectors between governments and farmers because of the risk of like famines, droughts, floods, especially global competition, right? Globalism and the agricultural sector going global has created there's been a lot of interesting and different mechanics used by states to maintain some stability in their agricultural sectors. That includes things like minimum prices and subsidize. It's nothing out of the ordinary. It's not like, I don't think it's like against any creed of a modern state or democracy to do something like this. And again, even the United States, where we tout our love of the free market, we subsidize our farmers all the time. So the idea of this going into opening up the Indian agricultural industry to the private sector, it would be a little bit worrying. I think I think that these farmers are worried that they're going to get exploited by maybe foreign investment. I'm not exactly sure how much would be domestic or foreign investment in the private sector of the agriculture industry. I'd have to look more into that. But I can understand how someone who is used to being having a guarantee by the government, having a stable job, having that be open up to a volatile private sector, which especially for like foreign investment in agriculture has had a lot of extortion in the past. I could see why people are upset. And then, of course, you brought up the free speech angle, which plays into it. And we talked about the guy, Vidya Krishnan, who is the writer. You showed me this link from The Atlantic. He's also a writer for The Caravan in India, and how they were like shut down by the government for criticizing. For criticizing, and he said how that's completely antithetical to India's creed, and they hold a lot of the same things that Americans hold dear: free speech, the idea that you can be, you successful regardless of race, religion, and sex. These are things that ideally India holds dear, but like you said, it's changing into a Hindu nationalism, and that also plays a part in this Punjabi revolt or protests. And so, yeah, man, we're seeing huge, massive protests for what I would consider legitimate reasons in all three of these cases. And a common theme is, who are the big players in like the economic aspect of it, right? With Myanmar and Russia, with billionaires in China, or like here with India and Myanmar, you have the problems with free speech. Both of these times in Myanmar and India, the internet was shut down by the government, a common tactic when protests start to get out of control. You shut down the internet so you can stop the social media formations of protests. So, it's interesting to see three big protests happen at once, and to see all the parallels, and to understand why these phenomenons happen, and to not just see them as random flashes in the pan. We can actually pull information and patterns out of what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, absolutely agreed. And the one thing I'll just say before we're done with this one is I actually think, very well said. I totally agree with you. And, I would be down to have a conversation with Modi's government about deregulating the agricultural industry and what that could do to the economy. But the problem is they're silencing it before that conversation even takes place. And that's just kind of this preemptive canceling or suppression of free speech. But also, I would say that I actually think of the three countries we've talked about today, India is the worse off, because it's out in the open in Russia. It's out in the open in Myanmar. But India is still in the suppressive stage. And I think that's going to be hard to control, especially with the different religious nationalism and just the clashing. I just think India is almost too big to be a democracy, to be completely honest. And we're going to see that, I think. So, yeah.
Interesting take. Let us know what you think on this. What do you see? Is there any patterns for these protests? Are these legitimate protests? Do you think that these protests will be successful or change anything or not? Let us know your thoughts. We want to hear it all. And feel free to check us out on YouTube, Podbean, Facebook, Instagram, and now recently we're on Spotify. So if you enjoy listening to your podcast on Spotify, look for us at the Tonic Accord at Spotify, and you can get all our content there in audio form. If you're watching us live, stay tuned, because we're going to be doing our tier list of news sources, who sucks, who doesn't, and our opinions on that. I'm sure you'll agree or not. And so stay tuned for that. And if you're listening recorded, then that will be the next episode for you guys. So take care, everyone, and thanks for listening.
You better agree with us.